All right. This is the year that I'm supposed to reveal to you who I really am. So that's what I'm doing right now. This won't be easy to say, so please bear with me. I'm here to talk to you about the future regarding a very dark matter. I'm actually a time traveler from exactly 500 years in the future, in the year 2525. Now you know where my name comes from. You see, I was tasked with gaining a large social media following so that the message I'm about to tell you right now could gain enough traction to make a difference. And I think I've done that. And how I did it was important to the message itself, so listen carefully. What I'm about to tell you won't seem very likely given current trends, but I can assure you that it happens. 500 years from now, every single person on earth is a Christian. And not just Christians in name only, but Christians who truly follow and value the teachings of Jesus Christ. Because everyone is a Christian, we don't even call ourselves Christians anymore. I never even actually used that word or even heard that word before until I went back in time and learned what it was supposed to mean. In the future, we all just genuinely behave the way Christ instructed, no label necessary. We have no attachments. We don't covet materialistic possessions. We give freely to anyone in need. Letting go of everything makes it so that there's want for nothing. Everyone simply takes care of each other. We all do our part. Nobody even needs to ask. And the result is that everyone has what they need. Relationships are genuine without seeking advantage. There's no abuse. People aren't even envious. There's no systems of exploitation because the incentive structures aren't even there. It's essentially a paradise on earth. Or I should say that it was a paradise on earth, even though it hasn't technically happened yet. See, when I was 8 years old, in the year 2484, 3 spaceships landed on Earth and made contact with us. We thought they were alien spaceships at first, but some strange human-like people disembarked. And yes, they were clearly human, but their features were unlike anything we had ever seen before. Their skin and hair was different. They had bluish skin and glowing hair. And later we found out that they weren't aliens, but time travelers. And that's how I eventually found my way to you, by using their advanced technology. But I was very much not authorized to do so. I assure you I had a good reason. Our instinct as what you call Christians was to welcome them and treat them as we would want to be treated. So we came bearing gifts. We were good neighbors. And despite being time travelers, the visitors still acted very surprised by our welcoming behavior, and they seemed to admire us for it. And it was no wonder, because the tenets of their religion are in direct harmony with how we lived our lives as the model Christian society. And that seems like a good thing, doesn't it? I mean, we were on the same page, right? Their religion is called benevolism, based on the etymology of the word we know as benevolent. Their religion is also a selfless one. It teaches them to disregard petty pleasures in favor of deeper meaning. It teaches them to refrain from the pointless pursuit of wealth in favor of giving what they have to those in need. It teaches them to work not for their own advancement and glory, but for the advancement of each other and for the glory of their God, who is defined as love itself. Their religion seems perfectly compatible with ours. That can only be a good thing, right? Given their professed values, it was obvious that we could live harmoniously with these strange visitors. But then something quite curious and terrible happened. These travelers quickly turned against us, and despite the perfectly compatible values espoused by these travelers, they saw our resource-rich Earth as a way to gain tremendous wealth for themselves, and they saw the Christian populace as naive and ripe for exploitation. Despite claiming to value selflessness, our selflessness was shocking to them, and they saw it as a way to take advantage of us. This was a virgin planet, and they wanted to rape it, so that's exactly what they did. They used us for slave labor. They worked us to death, literally to death. When we tried to defend ourselves, they easily slaughtered us with their advanced technology. They called in more and more spaceships, and we were forced to extract resources for them. If we failed to meet our quotas, we were tortured and killed. Our children were killed. It seemed that our lives had absolutely no value to these travelers. And in only about 40 years, the entire population of Earth, that's 22.4 billion people, was reduced to a few million. And when I left, we were on the verge of disappearing entirely. It was genocide. The big question we, as what you would call Christians, kept asking ourselves was, how could these travelers even be able to pretend to share our values? Yeah, their words align with ours, but their actions were the very antithesis of anything like Christianity. If the tenets of their religion were identical to Christianity, then why were they so preoccupied with power and wealth at the expense of human suffering, misery, and death? If even their very clergy oversaw our subjugation and our eventual demise. How could they reconcile such blinding, absurd contradiction? So, now that I told you, do you think there's a way we can prevent this from happening? No, we can't prevent it. I can understand why you wouldn't believe anything I just told you, but if you don't believe me, then you'd be both right and wrong. Thematically, it's true. It happened, but the details have been altered. You see, we can't prevent it because it doesn't actually happen 500 years from now. It happened 500 years ago. I'm referring to the most ironic historical event that has ever occurred. Back then, 5 centuries ago, there was a group of people who lived in a tropical paradise, the islands of the Caribbean, and they were called the Arawak people, specifically the Tainos of the Arawakian people, and they lived quite harmoniously as fishermen, hunters, and farmers. They were very peaceful people who all worked together and freely shared everything they had with each other. They didn't really have a concept of ownership the way we do. So deliberately accumulating far more than they needed would have seemed quite senseless to them. They already had everything they needed as the earth provided in that area of abundance. And they didn't have to worry about competing for survival. Everyone just took care of each other. Everything was communal. Though they did have a social class that constituted their leaders, and though they were pre-industrial revolution, they were very basically living the end goal of communist idealism in a stateless and moneyless society. And obviously they weren't technically Christians in the traditional sense, but for the most part, they seemed to have values that aligned quite well with Jesus' teachings, long before ever hearing the name Jesus Christ. But when they did finally hear the name of Christ, it meant their doom within a single generation. They didn't have a system of writing and record keeping, so much of what we do know of them came from the people who killed them. Normally, you would not want your history to be written by your enemies, as they tend to paint you in a harsher light to justify killing you. But for Columbus, the slaughter was so obvious that it was more about painting them as inferior. On October 11th, 1492, Columbus finally reached the Bahamas, at a landing point that is now marked with a giant cross. He named that island San Salvador, meaning Holy Savior. The Taino people greeted him with gifts. On that day, he wrote of the encounter in his journal, quote, "They afterwards came to the ship's boats where we were, swimming and bringing us parrots, cotton, threads and skeins, darts, and many other things. And we exchanged them for other things that we gave them, such as glass beads and small bells. In fine, they took all and gave what they had with good will. It appeared to me to be a race of people very poor in everything. They neither carry nor know anything of arms, for I showed them swords, and they took them by the blade and cut themselves through ignorance." Just 3 days later, on October 14th, Columbus searched for a place to build a fort. On that day, we begin to see his intent to enslave the Tainos, as he wrote, quote, "It might be converted into an island in 2 days, though I do not see that it would be necessary, for these people are very simple as regards the use of arms, as your highnesses will see from the 7 that I caused to be taken to bring home and learn our language in return, unless your highnesses should order them all to be brought to Castile, or to be kept as captives on the same island, For with 50 men they can all be subjugated and made to do what is required of them. On November 12, 1492, Christopher Columbus wrote this in his report to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, quote, "I saw and knew that these people are without any religion, not idolaters, but very gentle, not knowing what is evil, nor the sins of murder and theft, being without arms and so timid that 100 would fly before one Spaniard, although they joke with them. They, however, believe and know that there is a God in heaven, and say that we have come from heaven. At any prayer that we say, they repeat and make the sign of the cross. Thus your highnesses should resolve to make them Christians, for I believe that, if the work was begun, in a little time, a multitude of nations would be converted to our faith, with the acquisition of great lordships, peoples, and riches for Spain. Without doubt, there is in these lands vast quantities of gold." Columbus got this idea that there was a lot of gold there because some of the Taínos had gold in their jewelry, which they freely shared with Columbus and his men, causing them to believe that there was an infinite supply. And at this point, Columbus wrote of how the people swam out to the ship just to bring him and his men food and drink. Also, in November, Columbus began to explore southeast toward the Lesser Antilles, but the Taínos warned him not to go that way because of the Kalinago, meaning strong men, who were fierce warriors, rumored to be cannibals, but that's disputed. After all, they also claimed that these frightening warriors only had one eye in the middle of their foreheads. Regardless, the Spanish called them Caribs, which evolved into canibelas, meaning cannibal. And the word Carib is also from where we get the word Caribbean. But Columbus first landed where the people were very peaceful and vulnerable, and the Taínos who greeted him there warned Columbus about the warlike Kalinago. The Taínos were very welcoming and helpful to these strangers from Europe, as if heeding Jesus' very words without the need to learn them, the way Columbus wanted them to. On Christmas of 1492, while Columbus was sleeping, an inexperienced cabin boy manned the helm and accidentally ran the Santa Maria ashore on the northern coast of Hispaniola, which is present-day Haiti. The ship was lost, and the Taínos were very diligent about helping them. Columbus wrote in his journal that the chief, who he called their king, even wept for them. On that day, he wrote, quote, "They are a loving people, without covetousness, and fit for anything. And I assure your highnesses that there is no better land nor people. They love their neighbors as themselves, and their speech is the sweetest and gentlest in the world, and always with a smile." It's interesting that he was so complimentary toward them, and even attributed to them Christ-like qualities, like loving their neighbors as themselves, yet also saw them as ripe for exploitation. The next day, on December 26th, Columbus wrote, quote, "Now I have given orders for a tower and a fort, both well built, and a large cellar, not because I believe that such defenses will be necessary. I believe that with the force I have with me, I could subjugate the whole island, which I believe to be larger than Portugal, and the population double. But they are naked and without arms, and hopelessly timid." So he built a fort made out of the wood of the Santa Maria, and he called it Fort La Navidad, which means Christmas in Spanish, Fort Christmas. He left 39 men at that fort and sailed back to Spain with a couple dozen Taíno captives and very exaggerated reports of fields of gold. He was obsessed with gold. I found 140 mentions of gold in his journal up until that point. He credited God with this great discovery of wealth. So investments were made and he was sent back with 17 ships this time, instead of just 3, and over 1,200 men. They were tasked with producing an abundance of 2 things, gold and slaves. Meanwhile, the 39 sailors he left behind at Fort Christmas had already attempted to collect both gold and people, women and children, for sex and slavery. And though they weren't known for being warriors, the Taino people became outraged at how they were being treated and finally resisted the 39 men and killed them. When Columbus returned 11 months later, he was quite wrathful. Because he set expectations so high back in Spain, he had to produce results for his wealthy investors. So he began the transatlantic slave trade by capturing a lot of Taino people and sent 560 of them back to Spain as slaves. But only 200 of them actually survived the journey. Those survivors were marched from the coast to Seville, a strange land where they were separated from their families and died within months due to beatings and sickness. I remember seeing a story about illegal parrot smuggling. The story stuck with me because of the cruel way they transported parrots, by sliding them into cardboard tubes where they couldn't even move. And that's sort of like the way they used to transport slaves across the Atlantic. Slaves were not treated as passengers. They were treated as cargo and stored in cargo decks. When you think of a ship's deck, like the crew quarters, you think of something akin to the floor of a house, a place large enough to stand. But slaves back then were packed together and slid into decks that had only 18 inches between the floor and the ceiling. Not even enough room to turn over or lie on your side. They were chained to the floor by the neck and the feet and endured a month on the open sea, defecating, urinating, vomiting, and bleeding all over each other until the decks were covered with a slime of human filth. But those were slave ships. Most of Columbus's ships were caravels, about 5 times smaller than the later slave ships. They were each crewed by about 25 men. And Columbus sent only 4 of those tiny ships back with 560 slaves. So they had to have been packed very tightly, and it's no wonder many of them did not survive the voyage. Columbus still had to fulfill his promise of gold, too. So he had the rest of his Taino captives in the Caribbean search for gold that oftentimes was not to be found. Any of them who met their gold quota after 3 months were given a copper token to wear around their neck as proof that they met their gold quota. Any Taino people caught without one of these tokens around their neck had their hands chopped off and were ordered to show the others what failure meant for them, but they usually bled to death. There wasn't enough gold to find, so the Taino attempted to flee, but they were easily hunted down by dogs and men in armor wielding swords. They tried to fight back and even got some help from the Kalinago they once feared, but they were no match. So rather than endure torture and execution, many resorted to mass suicide and even poisoned their own children and babies, because death was the only escape from torture. Those who were captured were often worked to death in the mines. Unfamiliar diseases from Europe also took their toll, but there was no rebounding like there was in Europe because of the immensity of their oppression. Las Casas was a conquistador and a bishop who actually tried to help the Taínos, to no avail, and he reported that there were 3 million Taínos in the Caribbean, but Some historians say that's exaggerated and that it was probably somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million by the time Columbus arrived in 1492. Regardless, by the 1530s, just 40 years later, there were only around 1,000 of them left. This genocide of the Taínos is known as the Holocaust of the Caribbean. The Spanish were hell-bent on obtaining enormous sums of wealth, slave labor, new territory, and to spread Christianity in a place that already embodied what it meant to truly live as a selfless person, unconcerned with the riches of which the coming Christians were obsessed. It is the most ironic historical event I can think of. Christians subjugating and murdering people who embodied the core tenets of Christianity so blatantly that it was foreign to Columbus and his men, shocked them even that they had no concept of theft, murder, or wickedness. The Taínos were so Christ-like that what else would the Christians of the Old World do besides slaughter them for riches, as that was their history? It's what they knew and what they spent centuries doing in the name of the very man who would weep if he knew what they would do in his name. They had centuries to pervert the religion so far beyond what it originally was that they couldn't recognize that they were supposed to be like the very people they enslaved and killed. In his report to the court in Madrid, Columbus said of the Taíno people that they, quote, are so naive and so free with their possessions that no one who has not witnessed them would believe it. When you ask for something they have, they never say no. To the contrary, they offer to share with anyone. What does that sound like to you? To me, that sounds like the very embodiment of Christ's teachings. Yet Columbus, a Christian claiming to do God's work, said that such people were unbelievable. When people who called themselves Christians, yet did not act like it, encountered people who did not call themselves Christians, yet did act like it, the result was genocide. And all of this unimaginable cruelty was done in the name of profit, by people who considered themselves good, God-fearing Christians. How do you make sense of that? The same story repeated itself over and over and over again, and gave rise to what Christians boast about today as being Christian nations, Western civilization. They brag because these nations are so wealthy and advanced, both technologically and socially, nations that were built upon the exploitation of others. Despite these ill-gotten gains and the obscene wealth that followed, they proudly call these lands Christian. We're so advanced, you see. We figured out how to move at great speed and stare at screens. And yes, we gave rise to free people and civil rights, both technological and social advancements never seen until we moved further from an already ancient religion claiming credit for something it had never once duplicated throughout all its history. Regardless, it's certain that the Taínos were far happier than we are. We're sold the idea that in order to reclaim that happiness, we have to return to religion. But it was religious men who took that happiness in the first place, took it and smashed it for wealth and power. Exactly what many Christians of the modern era covet as well, wealth and power. The question I asked earlier was, how could they reconcile such blinding, absurd contradiction? Well, that's what I ask of you now. And the answer is often this: we all fall short, none of us are good, and everyone sins. Such an answer gives rise to yet another question. Of what use, then, is the word Christianity? Think about it. What's more important, calling yourself a thing or actually being the thing? If you call yourself a pilot, but never flew an airplane, are you more or less of a pilot than someone who never calls himself a pilot, yet constantly flies airplanes? What matters more is what a person does and how a person behaves than what they claim to be. In this way, there are many who call themselves Christians who aren't, and many who don't call themselves Christians who are. People who call themselves Christians will often offer the excuse that nobody is good, that we all fall short, and that the world is a fallen place. Yes, but there were good people who lived in peace and harmony. No, they didn't know about all the technicalities of some ancient Near Eastern religion. But what does that matter? Because the people who did know were the ones who slaughtered them. Spirit of the law or letter of the law? At least they had the spirit, the one that mattered. And the people who killed them obeyed neither spirit nor letter. But the excuses made for them is that we all fall short. No, I don't buy it. That's not good enough. Some of us fall a lot shorter than others. Words have meanings. What's the point of calling yourself a Christian if those values are completely absent in your life, or even worse, to be used as only an aesthetic to signal to others that you're on their side? What's the point of calling yourself a Christian if you advocate for systems rooted in coveting and that only work if envy can be leveraged? What's the point of calling yourself a Christian when you worship billionaires and support policies and principles that result in taking from the poor to give to the rich? What's the point of calling yourself a Christian when you're vile, vulgar, and arrogant toward anyone who disagrees with you? What's the point of calling yourself a Christian when your politics are rooted in fear of others you should be welcoming, and fear of losing your materialistic possessions, and even fear of losing your own life? How are such traits not oxymoronic in light of Jesus' core message? Both history and modernity have tainted the term Christianity to the point of uselessness, because when you meet someone who calls themselves a Christian, they can be very kind, generous, and just. Or they can be very vile, greedy, and corrupt. Polar opposites. What good is the word, then, as a description? Saying someone is a Christian tells you absolutely nothing about them. If the Taino people can embody the core tenets of Christianity but not be called Christian, while the Spanish explorers were driven by violence, lust, and greed, yet were called devout Christians, then what good is the word? It's meaningless. Christianity doesn't exist. Not anymore. Now it's just a bastardized word, used and abused. Currently, I don't think there is an accurate label to call someone who actually follows Christ. Christianity doesn't exist in the same way that communism doesn't exist. It has been tried before, it has even existed before, but in both cases, people merely calling themselves Christians or communists end up taking over and eradicating the true form of the ideology and replacing it with a corrupt version that is mistaken as the real thing, but only resembles the real thing in name only, and sometimes even just as an aesthetic. And that can give a bad name and a bad reputation to both. But it wasn't something I fully realized until I learned more about what both of them really are. I've always had it backwards, and you can see this mistake sometimes reflected in what I've said over the years on social media. I certainly wasn't alone in the mistaken sentiment either, and that big mistake was that I thought the problem was with the ideology rather than the people. I used to like to say that I'm attacking religion, but not religious people. In order to relate that to religious people, I used to tell them that it's like attacking the sin, not the sinner. As I honestly reflect on my thought process, I realize in truth, I was just saying that so that people wouldn't think I'm a bigot. And perhaps I was even trying to convince myself that I wasn't a bigot. Because after all, you're bigoted toward people, not ideologies. So attack ideologies and then you'll be safe, right? But what if that's the exact wrong thing to do? Besides a few factual and social disagreements here and there, what if the ideologies are mostly fine and it's the people who got it wrong? Or the people who exploit any vulnerabilities in the ideology for their own advantage? Well, in that case, I'm sorry, but it is correct and good to go after those people who are wrong. If the math says that 2 plus 2 equals 4 and you're saying it's 7, well, in that case, you're the problem, not the math. We need to come to terms with that. Sometimes the problem really is the Christians or the communists, and not Christianity or communism. So how do we keep from being bigots if that's the case? Well, by allowing individuals to speak for themselves. Unlike judging someone based on their race, gender, or sexual orientation, when it comes to ideology, it's the person's own words that either convict or exonerate them. Their guilt in that regard can vary depending upon how indoctrinated they are, but in terms of consequences, that doesn't really matter. If someone is murdered, yes, the motive can teach us some things, but it's never going to bring the victim back to life. Likewise, if you're causing the world to be a worse place because you can't properly understand the ideology you espouse, or you're just insincerely wearing it as a cloak for whatever reason, well, then the world is paying the price, and that's a you problem. And people would be justified to be critical of you for it. If you're someone who calls yourself a Christian and you feel attacked by the things I've said in this video, then you're probably exactly the type of person who should feel attacked, and exactly the type of person who should not call yourself a Christian. But if that's not the case, if you don't associate with the past, if your instinct was not to defend Columbus or justify genocide by appealing to the fruits of Western civilization, or appeal to your ego, or tell me that I should go after some other religious group instead, or to find some fault with me to excuse what I say, if being a Christian is not something you use to club people with as a way to feel superior, and if you lament the fact that people have used the word Christianity to do the opposite of what they should do, then I am honored to be able to speak to you today. Thank you for listening to me, and I shall be happy to listen to you.